There's a moment in Basic Lee when Stewart Lee starts running around the stage mimicking observational comedians. The crowd's reaction wasn't something I'd heard before.
Okay, here we go. Live at the Apollo.
The response is knowing. It must be a strange feeling for Lee, whose once defiant counter-comedy, to be greeted with the warm approval of Noel Gallagher playing the first chord of Wonderwall. It captures the tone of the special, Lee still in a league of his own, leaning heavily into themes from his past. Stewart Lee is one of the greats. Yeah, I'm a pretentious comedy nerd, but I seriously think you could argue any special from 90s comedian to content provider or his series Comedy Vehicle to be the best recorded stand-up of all time. Long-term viewers of this channel know I've basically treated him as a god since his channel's inception. I talked about him at length in an, in retrospect, self-indulgent and poorly paced video essay. I've snuck him into nearly every video I've done. I've actually had to tell myself I'm not allowed to put Stewart Lee in certain videos because it just gets too much.
No, Josh. No. No, Josh. No more Stewart Lee!
This puts me in an interesting position for this review, not just because of my bias towards him. Basically, hasn't been greeted with the usual acclaim, with many saying it lacks the depth of his best work. Lee, being Lee, addresses this criticism within the show.
You'll realise that, of course, this show is as rigorously structured as they always are. You may realise that, you may not realise that. None of the critics did.
It's fair to say reviewing this special feels like walking into a trap.
It's a trap!
There's also a fear that when I make critical points, I'm at risk of sounding like a total moron and a bunch of Lee supporters will turn up at my door.
It's actually a meta-commentary on the structure of stand-up itself. I can't believe you didn't see that.
There's a lot of factors that make this review an intimidating task, but just because Lee is self-aware doesn't mean he is above critique.
Self-awareness does not absolve anybody of anything.
His 2022 double album Snowflake Tornado was a step down in my opinion. Despite brilliant moments, the Dave Chappelle drip tray and the joke about nothing, I found these specials, particularly Snowflake, a bit stodgy, self-indulgent. Splitting the special into 2 standalone hours showed Lee struggling to weave his usually intricate narrative tapestry into a 2-hour show. Off the back of this, we get Basic Lee, his 8th full-length stand-up special. It's a shift in favour of something faster, looser, and more interactive. This is stand-up stripped down, as Lee repeats,
One man, one microphone, one audience, pure, simple, classic.
The minimal stage and set design is a far cry from the scattered ruins of comedy DVDs and content provider or the threaded cityscape of Carpet Remnant World. I know this is the point, but it lacks visual punch. He could have performed in the round at the audience's level to make up for the lack of visual interest. The set is bookended by the first routine Lee performed in 1989. There is an idea of Lee returning to his origins and trying to see it through a different lens. Lee continues to look stuck out of time. He's dressed in a knee-length blazer and skinny jeans with his quiff of grey hair. He looks like a post-punk Bilbo Baggins. The biggest positive going into Basic Lee is how playful Lee is. He maintains the aura of cantankerous curmudgeon, but he's clearly enjoying himself. He happily pokes fun at his persona, he chuckles and chides the audience, and he breaks more than I've ever seen him. The crowd is intensely receptive, buoyed by the huge amount of interaction. He tackles crowd work in his own defiantly low-key way, often getting the audience to repeat themselves over and over until they penetrate his hearing aids. But he is also incredibly quick on the draw.
Would you read that, Madam Harry Potter? And the cup that was... You'd read it, wouldn't you, sir? Yes. No? Leave her alone? Okay, fine. The thing about audience interaction, you have to know when to just walk away.
Comparing an older guy in the front row to Ingmar Bergman's death in The Seventh Seal is hilarious. Part of me missed the snark of content provider, where Lee used the back camera to mock the audience he is performing for, but what you get in its place is something that feels genuinely fun. It's a reminder of how vital Lee is to recorded comedy. There is no Netflix manicure, the feeling that Lee recorded multiple shows and is cutting between the best performances. This interaction, as Lee says, derails the momentum of the rest of the routine, yet it is kept in. When people people wander in late, Lee, off the cuff, abandons the last couple jokes of the opening routine, knowing this interruption has nullified their effect. There are constant cuts back to this shot with the same audience members, keeping us in the room. Even these seats in the front row remain unfilled. Any other comedian would surely get people to fill this gaping hole, but in the words of a famous comedian, Lee plays the cards he is dealt. It works with the central idea that basically is a return to stand-up at its essence, a relationship between audience and performer. And as Lee riffs and problem solves his way through the night, you feel more than ever you are watching a singular live performance.
It's a shame, isn't it? Because we're cutting across to this man for all the responses about sexism, but he's sat next to a man who hasn't laughed once at anything. And he's going to be in all the shots, in a grey-haired, judgmental, haunted figure, like a premonition of my own death in a big coat. Fucking nightclub bouncer and Ingmar Bergman's death from The Seventh Seal, and then Sid the Sexist next to him. A fucking ridiculous trio of the three main kinds of men, actually. So
there is definitely less of a line between the character of Stewart Lee and his actual self. This pays off in crowd work where you see something softer and more playful. On the other hand, you lose the opaque quality of seeing beneath the facade to the worries of the man underneath. I talked about this at length in my James Acaster Unreliable Narrator video, but this gave Lee's best work a lot of depth, and the lack of distinction between his persona and real self takes away from the show's thematic richness. Lee's writing is still often caustic, wicked, and ingenious. A routine about Prince Andrew using Paddington bears as bait made me spit up my soup. Sean Lock also did this brilliantly, multiplying punchlines by quickly shifting perspective. First you've got a set of pithy, almost Frankie Boyle one-liners, then Lee expands this into a surreal situation where Prince Andrew becomes a nefarious cartoon villain, complete with specific details.
you got a little Paddington bear doll there in the grass by the swings. Next to that, some kind of stick or a scepter stuck into the ground. On top of that, the lid of an empty Pizza Express box. They crawl in there.
Note how Lee saying stick or scepter and the lid of an empty Pizza Express box grounds the joke in reality. It's often this grounding that gets surreal jokes to work. After this, you'd expect the joke to be over. Instead, Lee breaks the fourth wall to describe submitting the joke to a newspaper and uses their vague response, which in itself is hilarious that they think the joke can be fixed, to launch into a final, much more graphic situation.
You know, the suggestion Prince Andrew is sitting lying on silken sheets in the royal apartments, calling to the footman beyond the door, "More Paddingtons! More Paddingtons now!" And they're throwing the Paddingtons in, one after another, as fast as Prince Andrew can ruin them. Paddington, 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 ruined, 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 and he never broke a sweat. He never broke a sweat.
Lee, who can write jokes and chooses not to, deftly switches styles and perspectives, transforming a single premise into a myriad of punchlines. Despite this, Lee never loses the joke's continuity. There's a logical progression from one joke to another, and there's a consistent escalation throughout the routine. You've also got trademark Lee rhythms, Paddington, 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 ruined, 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 providing almost poetic closure. He turns a relatively simple premise into three different types of jokes, all somehow working together. This is aspirational content for comedians. There are so few comics who can switch up their comedic perspective and delivery so effortlessly. A joke about J.K. Rowling using a male pseudonym when she writes thrillers is ingeniously coy. As someone who has written a Harry Potter joke, I can't believe this take was staring me in the face. Lee not only discovers the elephant in the room, but then never points at it. What you end up with is a game of cat and mouse, Lee dangling the punchline before diverting somewhere unexpected. It's an evolution of this old riff about Lee telegraphing a punchline so clearly he doesn't need to say it, only this time Lee is another move ahead.
The public veneration of a wrinkled old corpse. Well done. When J.K. Rowling writes thrillers for adults, she calls herself Robert Galbraith, which is a man's name. She isn't actually a man, she just identifies as a man for the purpose of writing thrillers. Which women can't do because they get too frightened while writing them. See? wasn't what you thought. It was just a sexist joke from the 80s.
So there are dizzying highs. There's also a joke about Fleabag inventing looking at the camera that I haven't even mentioned, but basically finds Lee's ingenuity battling an army of predictable elements. That bit I just mentioned about the audience imagining something funny in their heads, Lee makes virtually the same joke some 30 years later. Dependable riffs rear their heads, letting himself go, people coming in late, saying he can't write jokes for the prevailing political parties, bearded male fans touting his genius, a jazz overlay, foreshadowing a routine in the second half when he moves into full-on experimental territory. I did wonder at points if Lee was using the premise of the show, returning to the basics of stand-up, to reuse a bunch of old material. As mentioned, there's a bit where he makes fun of comedians like Michael McIntyre by running around the stage. This is a bit he's been repeating since Carpet Remnant World in 2012. It puts Lee in a slightly compromised position. He makes fun of the emptiness of comedians like McIntyre, yet what is he doing? Falling back on his own set of predictable motifs. You sense that Lee is in a bit of a holding pattern comedically, and because these jokes lack their initial surprise, Lee can't push them as far. In Carpet Remnant World, boiling observational comedy down to running around had huge novelty. For minutes on end, Lee circles the stage, peers out over the audience, shifts the microphone stand. The premise that it is impossible for observational comedians to talk about subjects of any weight or complexity, in this case anti-Islamic ideology, becomes obvious as Lee naively dominates the space, at one point just running in a circle like a lobotomized dog. It comes back to that shit bottle formula of a bit moving from funny to unfunny to hilarious the longer it goes on. The punchline, when it eventually hits, is irrelevant. It's about the journey, not the destination.
Have you seen these Muslims they have now?
And basically, because the audience have been on the journey before, the gag doesn't have the staying power. What Lee does instead is smash two jokes together. You get the running around of Carpet, which is quickly followed by the noise-based gurning of his "Oh mate, no" bit in Content Provider, or his Gervais saying the unsayable routine in Snowflake. The feeling is of returning to a level in a video game you've already explored. The bit is also much shorter, and the clarity of the initial observation is lost. Likewise, a bit about the BBC pulling him off. It's so obviously a setup, the innuendo is so pre-planned, it almost smacks you in the face.
Thing to do, you know. So the BBC pulled me off, and now that's never got a laugh anywhere else.
A lot of Lee's comedic avenues, once some of the most innovative, unpredictable experiences in comedy, have lost their luster. It's a feeling I haven't felt with Lee before. Familiarity. I'm reminded of this moment in Carpet Remnant World.
It's easy being dead. The hard thing, if you're a comedian, is to stay alive. Keep on knocking out a new 2 hours every year, gradually decreasing the quality of your own obituary.
There is still a lot of joy, however, in watching Lee try to one-up himself. He rips into his passive-aggressive pseudo-intellectual male fans and Content Provider, but pushes the bit much further this time around.
And he's going, oh God, oh, he's a genius. And so am I, because I like him.
When more people come in late than he was anticipating, he says he's already done the bit he does when people come in late. You're seeing Lee find new comic avenues, new meta riffs to try and extend his comedic persona and find different lines. Perhaps my favourite joke is this equal parts lazy and scathing one-liner.
Because before I met Faye Presto, I'd always assumed all magicians were just creepy old men with suspiciously young female assistants. But after I met Faye Presto, blah, 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 rhythm of a joke.
Lee has in many ways become the varied physical performer he spent his career defying. Remember a 90s comedian when Robbie Williams said Lee should perform meditational relaxation tapes and then drew an outline in chalk around himself and stayed within it for the entirety of the show? Those days are long gone. Lanky Guy 95 on a Basically discussion forum made a fantastic point.
Perhaps oddly, I think his performance chops are better than his writing nowadays. Yeah. The more tightly written moments seem exhausted now, like I've heard him do those types of material multiple times before and better. At the same time, like, his voices, facial expressions and act-outs are funnier and more prominent than ever, and he's actually a great improviser in that character. Yeah.
The end of the special captures this struggle. In the final kind of act of the special, Lee says he went to a doctor to figure out if he had a neurodivergent disorder. The doctor is going to ask him 5 questions to figure this out. I was curious to see how Lee would tackle and talk about what was obviously a personal experience. But just as Lee's about to get into the meat of this material, on cue he starts a 10-minute divergent rant about the audience thinking about jazz in their heads. In all 3 viewings of the special, I mentally drifted. I wanted to skip this chunk or for Lee to approach it differently. As mentioned, these repetitious detours have become a staple of his act. Not only do we see them coming, but it's also fairly easy to guess where they will appear in his set, usually in the back half, just before the show's ending. This really feels like Lee by the numbers, and Lee himself seems to be dragging himself through this bit more than being inspired to perform it. Lee, being Lee, finishes the routine with a self-aware comment.
Relate back to the original thing. When I'm speaking, drop the jazz down and then bring all the themes together at the end and resolve it, perhaps with a diminished seventh. And for God's sake, don't get sidetracked into a long self-indulgent improvisation.
I understand this links back to the doctor's question about Lee's obsessiveness. I get its narrative purpose, but the ends don't justify the means. For one, the whole premise of trying to get the audience to imagine jazz in their heads seems very abstract. It feels like a parody of a Stuart Lee joke instead of something his character would actually insist upon. This ties back to the difference between Lee's persona and real self not being as clearly defined, which makes this material, which relies on us buying into Lee's pretentious alter ego, feel more forced. Also, Lee doesn't follow through with the bit. In Carpet Remnant World, when the jazz starts, there's a lighting change. Lee's demeanor becomes slow and somber. There's a tangible shift. But here, Lee's delivery remains consistent. There's no attempts to pair his delivery with the imagined jazz in the audience's heads. Maybe if Lee tried to deliver these questions in a somber tone while becoming increasingly irritated with the audience for imagining the wrong jazz, that could work. That way you get Lee trying to reveal something about himself while also failing to create the finale he imagined in his mind. But no, as soon as the riff ends, the idea is abandoned, and the final routine involves jazz being played anyway. It's all an elaborate bluff, but not in the way that leaves you in awe at the cunning of Lee's performance. It just feels tired, stalling the show's momentum going into the final stretch. The finale of the show is equal parts hilarious and confusing. Following on with the doctor's questions, Lee, in typical fashion, reveals he has trouble socializing. He struggles to look people in the eye, he craves routine, and stand-up creates chaos. When describing the life of his audience, however, the 9 to 5, the saxophone starts playing. He takes us through the week, sidling through repetitions of morning greetings and evening goodbyes. Him simply saying, "I'll see you tomorrow," in various ways show how overpowered he has become as a performer, how he can get laughs through the fundamentals of rhythm, pitch, and tone. Watching his delivery fall in and out of time with the saxophone creates these wondrous rhythmic trills and runs, blurring the boundaries between beautiful and absurd.
Yeah, I'll see it. Yeah, I'll see it. Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah, I'll see you. I'll see you. Yeah, I'll see you. I'll see you. See you, mate. Yeah, see you, mate. Yeah, see you, mate. Yeah, I'll see you, mate. Yeah, I'll see you, mate. Yeah, I'll see you. Yeah, it's Friday tomorrow, yeah. Roll on the weekend.
This is crack to me. I loved it. Lee then ends the special by harkening back to his first performance in 1989.
I was talking to my granddad the other day. He's 94 years old. I said to him, "Granddad, you are 94 years old. What, in your experience, has been the worst thing about growing so old?" And he said to me, "Stu, in my experience, the worst thing about growing so old has been watching all of the friends that I grew up with slowly dying off one by one." And I said to him, "Well, Grandad, You fed them those berries.
I'll admit, the first couple times I watched it, I was left confused. Is Lee jealous of a regular life, or is he glad his is more exciting? What was the conclusion from the Doctor? Equally the final joke about his grandfather and the berries? What does it mean? It reminded me of a season 3 episode of Comedy Vehicle where Chris Morris interrogates Lee's final joke.
Now, I just don't know what the hell that means.
No, you know what? It sounds clever, and I think people have laughed at it in an attempt to pass themselves off as clever.
Have you tried to work out what you mean?
No.
After going through the special, the truth lies somewhere between the two. Lee, I think, is concealing an autism diagnosis. Lee keeps this ambiguous, but the Doctor's questions point in this direction. Lee is envious of his audience and the simple familiarity of their lives. Note when Lee is trying to make the audience imagine jazz, it's an impossible task. Yet in describing the lives of his audience, it plays naturally. It's a metaphor. There's a harmony to regular life that Lee can't find on stage. Lee ends this routine by bitterly saying his audience are the ones desperate for connection, masking his own feelings by diverting into a joke. Lee is trying to show us the limits of connection he can have with his audience. He will always remain a detached figure, keeping his real self hidden, unable to truly look the audience in the eye. This is reaffirmed by the final joke book joke that takes an earnest sentiment of loss and sadness and flips it into a laugh. There's a beautiful message hiding here, and bookended by his first performance on stage, you feel Lee is using his diagnosis to see his career through a different lens. But it doesn't fully come through. The risk with Lee is that the message becomes so concealed it's difficult to see at all. Carpet Remnant World and Content Provider got the balance right, giving the audience enough to put the puzzle together while being opaque enough to linger in the memory. With Basic Lee, I found it harder to find a thematic through line, and the finale was too convoluted to hit emotionally. Now, this is my personal opinion, but a more poignant ending would be Lee being direct with his feelings. Lee's endings have always been veiled in ambiguity, but in a show about Lee coming to terms with his neurodivergence, a divergence that has resulted in him keeping his distance from the audience, perhaps the biggest sign of growth or change would be Lee removing his metatextual armor. I'm reminded of Jordan Brooks oh so briefly snapping out of his detached persona to recalibrate the entire show in the space of a few sentences. In Basic Lee, Lee has a moment of honesty but immediately backtracks. The most unexpected, funny and moving thing he could do would be to let this moment sit in the audience's lap and let us see the connection or lack thereof between them. It's interesting that in a special focused on returning to the basics of the art form, the underlying message has never felt more complicated and hidden.
And you craved that one moment of human intimacy, perhaps more than anything else you could imagine. And that's your life, isn't it?
Even when Lee isn't at his best, he's still in a league of his own. Lee is still a master craftsman, and it's a huge amount of fun to watch him loosen his braces, riff with the audience, and actually enjoy himself on stage. But Basic Lee is a lesser entry in a pioneering discography. You feel like his next show really needs to mix things up to stop becoming the formulaic crowd pleaser he spent his career defying. I think overall it's a step up from Snowflake Tornado, which also had narrative problems and felt a tad self-indulgent and serious, but it's a couple yards off the pace of his best work. Or, you know, maybe I just didn't get it.
Oh, Christ!